Donald Trump runs against one Joe Biden, fulfilling his obligations to run in a race for president of the United States. While Trump is running this race, he's doing this in the backdrop of a virus that is, at the time, I think over 300,000 people that had dropped dead. Because of the number of people and the concerns around COVID, the election in many of these places became basically mail-in. Now this, of course, is going to expand the number of people who mail in ballots because it's easy to just mail in a ballot as opposed to having to get up and stand in a line to make that vote. I would argue that this tends to lend itself to being beneficial to Democrats. I think if you expand the number of people who vote, especially when Republican policies tend to be pretty atrocious, well, if those people don't have to stand in line and the only thing they have to do is mail in a ballot, it is far easier to get a vote for one Joe Biden as opposed to people having to expend energy to vote for that one Joe Biden. I just think it expands the pool. My basic point in this is that Donald Trump loses the race. Now, instead of Donald Trump conceding, Donald Trump does what he said he was going to do. Not concede and basically argue and scream that he was cheated and that he was robbed. Trump argued that the only way this election could go is for him to win. And if he loses, then he was cheated. For months, he goes, or for at least a month, he goes with this notion that he was cheated. He stokes the audience. He gives them the conspiracy theory that Hugo Chavez the ghost of Hugo Chavez, working with Nicolas Maduro, the Cuban government, and of course, the tacit approval of the Chinese, basically was working with Kemp, who was working with the voting machines to cheat him and get Biden in office. Now, this is, again, after losing one court case after the next. It was like 50 court cases. Donald Trump lost all but like one of them, and the one that he won was insignificant. And that's if he won anything. My memory might be a little hazy around that particular point of whether he won any or not. I don't think he won any, but if he did win any, they were so insignificant as if to matter or not matter at all. Donald Trump lost. All indications point to such that he lost. And yet, he stoked this idea that he won. And it was very clear what was going to take place with him doing this. You were going to get a large segment of the population, Republicans, Trump supporters, that agreed and believed him. Even the people who didn't necessarily think he won, you still might have a lot of people that lump on just because. It's Trump. He's a right-winger. You have the militias that join in. You have the other right-wing organizations of Trump supporters that join in. And all of these people rush the Capitol. And they're being stoked by Trump. They're being stoked by various Republicans that are backing Trump in this charade of the fact that he won this race. All of this stuff is taking place. It is infinitely foreseeable what is going to happen. Whether it's infinitely foreseeable that they're going to raid the Capitol, and that is almost secondary to the point that it was conceivable that something big was going to happen. They threatened and tried to take the governor of Michigan hostage, and it seems the consequences for something that drastic were minor. Well, you have various political leaders that were stoking this crowd, stoking this audience to march on the Capitol. And with the various political actors and police presence that was in agreement with this crowd, that regardless of their responsibilities as cops, as human beings, they fundamentally and basically agreed with elements of the crowd. They let him ransack the Capitol. Nancy Pelosi has sent out a letter basically threatening that if you don't use the 25th Amendment, we will rip Donald Trump out of that office of president. And a little bit more to it. The 14th Amendment, where she points out of going after other political people who were involved in the process of helping that insurrection. Now, the question becomes, is Nancy Pelosi right to go that far and to be that strong? Now, keep in mind, this is them attacking the Capitol. Donald Trump, who lost this race at the time that they were going through their constitutional duties to certify the results for one Joe Biden, they were besieged by people trying to stop that specific function. Not to mention, the guy with the zip ties gets across where their head was. Meaning, you don't bring zip ties if you're there just for shits and giggles. The zip ties gets across something far more severe in regards to what they were thinking or potentially planning. It's a big deal. And undermining it or pretending as if it was is not going to fly. More to the point, though, whether it's a big deal for me or not is almost secondary to the fact that the congressmen who were there, who are usually utterly detached from real-world phenomena, were made uncomfortable. Not just made uncomfortable, you had people planting pipe bombs in the various areas of Congress. You had people basically going after Republicans and Democrats. Republicans weren't necessarily protected from this. And within seconds of the doors closing to basically barricade themselves inside before a mob of people ransacked the place. The difference between this and other situations is that all of these guys were in prize. All of them could have been attacked, and all of them were only seconds away from being caught. And whatever caught means in this case, they will be left at the whims of, let's say, the mob. What is Pelosi to do with this? Now, looking at this, not from a standpoint of anything that I want per se, because at this point, me having a dog in the hunt is kind of out of this. But looking at this as just raw political parties and the thing that political parties do in order to maintain power, to accrue more power, or for that matter, to undermine the other party, especially if it seems like, or if one of the parties believe that the deal has somehow been broken. Meaning, it's one thing for the political parties to fight one another, fair enough. But the Republican Party under Trump did something different. They didn't just not accept the results, which in and of itself is taboo. Under normal circumstances, candidates concede. Not only did he not accept the results, they also further inflamed a crowd to do what that crowd did. Meaning that Nancy Pelosi, who may under normal circumstances be willing to give up and give in to pretty much anything that takes place, George Bush invades a country. Nancy Pelosi knows George Bush lies, but she still doesn't go with impeachment, let alone talking about the 25th Amendment or the 14th Amendment. In this very specific case, what's different? What's different is that A, those people could have gotten their hands on Pelosi or whoever else was there for the most part in Congress. B, you're talking about something that's dealing with certifying the election results, and the people there, their job was basically to try to stop that or inhibit that process. And the congressmen who were pushing these guys and who were incentivizing these guys to do that, Nancy Pelosi is probably going to take as a jump of the shark or a breach of responsibility. A, you're putting me in danger, but B, on the top of putting me in danger, you're trying to stop something that's a constitutional function, the certification of results. These are massive, big deals. And Pelosi has looked at this in a way I think I would look at this, and I think it's somewhat right. You were doing things that went beyond the basics of politics. You were doing things to try to overturn the election result itself or to put members of Congress in danger by basically beefing up a conspiracy theory that doesn't have legitimacy, doesn't have an underlying facts to back it up. And our lives, was in danger because of it. Nancy Pelosi, whatever you want to think of her and whatever I think of her in the normal circumstances, in the very specific instance of threatening the 14th Amendment, she is right. She's right. Welcome to the soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is the Progressive Soapbox. Guys, if you dig this content, please like, share, and subscribe. You can always support this content through PayPal or Patreon. Yeah, under normal circumstances, I tend to take a lot of shots at Nancy Pelosi. But this is a little bit different. This is basic political warfare. The Republican Party was perfectly willing, especially the likes of Ted Cruz and every other Republican, be it senator or member in the House of Representatives, were perfectly willing to line up behind Donald Trump, whether they believed he won the election or not, whether it was for theater or whether it was for the politics of it all. It's less relevant. I would not be shocked if Ted Cruz took this case just to beef up his bona fides from a bunch of people that didn't necessarily think he measured up to Trump when he was running against Trump in the primary. Go back and look at the commentary where Cruz was confronting a group of Trump supporters and they were like, "You're not Trump. We believe in Trump. We believe in Trump." Is it possible that Cruz is doing this to beef up his bona fides and credibility among that group? Yes. I think that's possible entirely. You have Harley and you have many of the members in the House of Representatives that were basically backing the overthrow of the government of the United States in order to reinstall Trump, the person who didn't win the election. The gravity of that cannot be understated. They wanted to put Trump in as God King, and you had representatives in Congress backing them up. Meaning, when Trump wins, the Democratic Party and the rest of the public is supposed to acquiesce and accept the results. When Trump loses, Trump wants to then change the rules. So what is Pelosi to do in this situation? In raw political form, the Republican Party was willing to accept the results when they won, but were not willing to accept the results when they lost, and was willing to implement a raw fascist takeover of the country. I don't know how you define it as anything else. Whether the mob and the crowd had the capacity to stop them from decertifying the results is almost less relevant than whether or not the mob had the capability of injuring the political actors who were there trying to do it, and the intent and the point of the mob in going after them in the first place was to stop the constitutional duties of the country. The person that lost wanted to stay in power, and the mob was there to assist the person that lost in doing so. Whether or not it was going to keep them in power is secondary, which is kind of my point. Many of these guys were perfectly willing to back this crowd and back Donald Trump in the stealing and the theft of this election. And the pushing of that crowd, ginning that crowd up to do what it did. Should there be consequences? And should Nancy Pelosi, who's a political actor, who've just watched a bunch of other political actors try to basically take the country, should she stand by and give it a pass? And doesn't giving it a pass incentivize the behavior to take place again? This is one of those rare occasions where I actually agree with Pelosi. In a raw political fight sort of way, you should potentially invoke the 14th Amendment. You should rattle the cage of many of these Republicans that were perfectly willing to back Donald Trump in this for political reasons, entirely for political reasons. I don't even know if they believed them, but it was extremely self-interest, a massive self-interest that would get these guys to back Trump in this escapade. Whether or not they thought the election results would be overturned, whether or not they thought the restraint against them would never let this happen so they could be full-throated in their support, is almost irrelevant. In real terms, the president lost a race, making him a lame duck president. That president refused to accept the results. That president ginned up all sorts of anger, hostility, all sorts of concern and hysteria around something that he could not legitimize in any particular way. That he was somehow stolen, or the election was stolen from him, from the communists and the CIA and Governor Kemp. It's utterly astonishing. My point is that the crowd was ginned up and revved up exactly because of what the president and the people around the president was pushing. Not to mention, I do believe that there was a huge amount of self-interest in that crowd. I'm making the point that from the standpoint of Pelosi, the Republican Party's move, or the Republicans' move, was basically to try to steal the election. If the Democrats, meaning Nancy Pelosi, especially after they're taking both chambers, don't respond, how can you not respond? I guess that's kind of my point. I was always annoyed that the Democrats didn't respond when they tried to get rid of, let's say, attacking unions, and then unions being one of the main purveyors that put money into the pockets of that party, or for that matter, attacking voting rights. And you have a situation where it's undermining, basically disenfranchising a large number of African Americans by putting in these rule sets that makes it that much more difficult for them to get the voter IDs or go in and voting and those type of things. And they never responded to that stuff. And so in this very specific situation where you had something like, or even Bush invades a country, kills 1 million people, and there's no consequence. And because there's no consequence, you basically legitimize that as a presidential capability and a presidential power. Invasions of other countries. Because the government itself didn't do what it was supposed to do and hold Bush accountable and impeach his ass. In this very specific case, they're trying to impeach Trump twice. But I'm going further to that, to the letter itself, and talking about the 14th Amendment. And I'm trying to make the point that Pelosi doing this is not wrong, considering the Republican Party, what they were willing to do was to basically steal the election. Take a look at Pelosi's letter. Right here. So Pelosi basically says, look, either you take him out or we're going to take him out. Basically saying, you guys, cabinet, needs to invoke the 25th Amendment and get rid of Trump. If you don't do that, Pelosi is basically saying they will impeach him and remove him themselves. So right here, I want to call your immediate attention to action to be taken tomorrow morning when Majority Leader Hoyer will request unanimous consent to bring up the Raskin resolution. The resolution calls for Vice President to convene and mobilize a cabinet to activate the 25th Amendment to declare the President incapable of executing the duties of his office, after which the Vice President would immediately exercise powers as acting President. The text of the resolution can be found here. If we do not receive unanimous consent, this legislation is planned to be brought up on the floor following day. We're calling on the Vice President to respond within 24 hours. Next, we will proceed with bringing impeachment legislation to the floor. In protecting our Constitution and our democracy, we will act with urgency because the President represents an imminent threat to both. As the days go by, the horror of the ongoing assault on our democracy perpetuated by the President is intensified, and so is the immediate need for action. I look forward to the caucus call tomorrow. I'm grateful to all members for suggestions and observations and inputs that you have been sending. Your views on the 25th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, Section 3, and impeachment are valued as we continue. Now, 14th Amendment, third section. No person shall be a senator or representative in Congress or elector to the President and Vice President or hold any office, civil or military, under the United States or under any state, whom having previously taken an oath as a member of Congress or as an officer of the United States or as a member of any state legislature or as an executive or judicial officer of any state to support the Constitution of the United States shall have engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the same or given aid or comfort to enemies thereof. Basically, the 14th Amendment threat is saying that all sorts of members of Congress were perfectly instrumental in ginning up the crowd and putting forth something that they knew was not true, or at the very least had zero or little evidence to back up. And they pushed that for political reasons. They were calling for an insurrection against Congress as it was certifying the results and going about doing their duty to the U.S. Pelosi's point in showing the 14th is that basically members of Congress can be held accountable for fomenting and pushing forward and incentivizing an insurrection against the U.S. government as it went about its actions, and that Trump himself could be held accountable for such. And look, whatever you want to think, I do think Trump at this point is aware that he screwed up. This is what was taking place. This is from Jordan Sheridan in Status Quo. Jordan's been on the show a few times. This is basically what was taking place. This is what these guys were fomenting. Eventually, they take the cops' devices and start beating them with their shields and whatnot. They've shown you video of people just laughing and joking it up. You might have seen video with them taking pictures with cops and those type of things. But the reality of it is 5 people died. Not just 5 people died. You had situations where many of these people were put into threat because they were caught by themselves, especially African-American cops, many of which talk about the harrowing stories of what they had to deal with being in this crowd, being left in the lurch by basically their superiors. Yeah, this wasn't just a kumbaya type of engagement. This was people basically trying to attack the Capitol to stop these guys from counting and certifying the results. It's a big deal. And because the Republican Party was basically edging this on, it became basically a political warfare of sorts. Because it's political warfare of sorts, and because their responsibility or their job, their goal was basically to either keep Trump in office or to basically instill a huge amount of skepticism in the result itself. But the keep Trump in office part and to stop the certification of the results and the putting the various people in danger in Congress. What is Pelosi to do if not go after those members of Congress? Yeah, I'm not against this. I mean, at the end of the day, you've had a bunch of people who tried to do an insurrection. That insurrection actually did attack the Capitol. It did make it through the gates of the Capitol. It did put pipe bombs. It did almost get their hands on the members of Congress. And whatever I think and how lowly I think of the members of Congress, I damn sure don't necessarily want them taken by a mob that is making an argument that Donald Trump somehow won in the election that Donald Trump didn't win. Because they were willing to ignore the law and ignore this notion of who won the race. I don't see how it's wrong for Pelosi to use whatever's in her power, given by the Constitution, something that these guys were basically flagrantly ignoring, to expel or to threaten or to scare the shit out of members of Congress that were willing to go along with this putsch. I'll leave it here. This has gone longer than I wanted, but I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say subscribe. And under normal circumstances, yeah, I'm usually taking shots at Pelosi. But this is one of those times where I actually agree with her. Why wouldn't you use the 14th Amendment? They literally were trying to stop you from certifying the results. Understand what that means. Basically, that Donald Trump being put in as God King Trump. He's not president of anything at that point because anything that happens on the other side of that is not America, because he wasn't elected by any kind of laws. At the end of the day, people may say that Pelosi is taking advantage of the situation. She probably is, but she should. This is political warfare. I don't have a dog in this hunt. I'm thinking of this just as 2 parties that are acting in opposition to one another, and one party jumped the fucking shark by basically trying to throw out the election results. The party that is remaining, the party that didn't jump the shark, at this point, has a certain degree of leeway given to it by the party that did jump the shark to act. And the way they're going to act is basically to attack some of the Republican members. I got to be honest, I don't think Pelosi has the balls to go after the Republican members that were involved in trying to pull this off. I would be shocked if she did go that far and invoke the 14th Amendment. By the same token, I damn sure can't say she would be wrong to do so. Don't have a dog in the hunt. This is just political analysis from the standpoint of looking at 2 parties that are in competition with one another. One party has screwed up royally, and the other party has now an opportunity to take advantage. Whether she has the stones to do it or not, I don't know. But throwing out the 14th Amendment is a major threat to the various members of Congress that were perfectly willing to go along with undermining and destroying the U.S. government. Like, share, and subscribe. No, I don't think Pelosi has the balls to do it. I would be shocked if she did. And by the way, happily shocked, because it's adversarial. And it's adversarial in a way that recognizes that one party or one side didn't care about who won the election. They didn't care at all. And I understand that the Russiagate stuff went on for 3 years with the Democratic Party not accepting the election results. But they did accept the election results. Grudgingly, yes. But it wasn't a situation where they basically just said the election didn't take place, or they're acting as if that they just brazenly won it, despite the fact that they lost it, even going so far as to threaten various members in the states if they didn't go along with it. Threats that came across as if, look, when I take this thing, there may be criminal charges. Now, keep in mind, criminal charges are not given by God. Those things are just factors of law. Law isn't real. And if this country was taken over in some kind of fascist dictatorship, the laws would change almost overnight to correspond to whatever the fascist who's in office wants. I'm making the point that the threats that were being made to the various members in those states where Trump was pointing out, hey, it's against the law to hold and not, to basically not count certain votes. Yeah, but he was telling the guy to go find those votes. I'm just saying, it's dodgy, to put it mildly. This is a big deal, and I consider this a canary in the coal mine. And in an odd way, they weren't doing this for healthcare. They weren't doing this because 400,000 people dropped dead. They weren't doing this because of 4,000 people that day, as they were doing it, dropped dead. They were doing this to basically overturn the results of the election, and whether or not they could do it or not, whether or not they had the capabilities or not, is secondary to the fact that they did have the capacity to damage and cause a lot of it. We've had situations where Congress members have been shot before. This was a situation where the Capitol itself was raided, and those members who were there to certify the results could have all been taken hostage by the guy with the zip ties, and who knows where it could have gone with the pipe bombs. Don't downplay this. Do not downplay this. Like, share, subscribe.